EOC Review, terms 161 through 180. Cuban Missile Crisis. October 15, 1962, spy planes discovered missiles in Cuba. ExCom, a group of American political leaders, meet several times, and the members rarely ever agree on what to do. Photos show evidence that Cuba also has long-range missiles that are capable of traveling 2,200 miles. ExCom suggests quarantine Cuba. Robert Kennedy then gives ExCom's recommendation to the president. On October 21st, 1962, Kennedy gave a speech to America informing us all that the bombs are a threat. Florida during the Cold War. During the time of the Cold War, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were on the brink of nuclear war over Russian missiles in Cuba. After the missiles were removed, the U.S. realized that it was vulnerable. Barracks near the Everglades were painted pink and were built to disguise the soldiers' base as a civilian building to Russian pilots in the Everglades. Many historical figures still stands there today. The Everglades was a good area for the base camp to set up and have access to Cuba and other areas close to the coast. Post-World War II prosperity. The causes for post-World War II prosperity were the need for all available materials to be focused on World War II military production, prevented the mass production of consumer products. Most people could not afford the new developmental advances. Economic reforms put into place during the Great Depression provided additional stability for the U.S. economy, which in turn allowed the future expansion of consumer borrowing and spending. The Great Depression severely suppressed consumer spending. The U.S. began rapid production of consumer goods for families and citizens. The GI Bill of Rights. Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the GI Bill June 22, 1944. It proposed to Congress a way to level the economic impact of the war's end and to integrate returning veterans back into American society. The result was the GI Bill, now widely credited with creating the post-war middle class. The GI Bill of Rights providing returned veterans with educational benefits, work, training, hiring preferences, and subsidized loans for buying homes, businesses, and farms. It continues today to be one of the last legacies of the Roosevelt administration. Baby boomers. After World War II, men came home from the service to their homes and families. The birth rate in the years following the war rapidly increased for more than a decade after the war. This occurrence increased the need for educational resources, suburbanization, as well as machinery for homes, and materials and products for families in America. Interstate Highway System. On June 29, 1956, President Dwight Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. The bill created a 41,000-mile national system of interstate and defense highways that would eliminate unsafe roads, inefficient routes, traffic jams, according to Eisenhower. It was essential for national interest. Network of highways that unite the country contributed to the nation's prosperity and increased suburbanization. Limits to post-World War II prosperity. Limits to the post-World War II prosperity included the Great Depression, poverty, lack of employment, production, and peacetime economy. Manufacturing for the war had stopped and left many Americans unemployed. America had to get back on its feet, but was left with no money and/or production to get anywhere for a while. Many artists made the most out of this time and became spectacularly famous due to their amazing insight in a time of darkness. Society. The Great Society was a set of domestic programs in the United States launched by President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1964 through 65. The main goal was the elimination of poverty and racial injustice. New major spending programs that addressed educational, medical care, urban problems, and transportation were launched in this period of time. The Vietnam War was a long struggle between nationalist forces attempting to unify the country of Vietnam under a communist government and the U.S. attempting to prevent the spread of communism. During the 1950s, a domino theory was in effect, meaning that if one country goes down, then they will all go down. We assisted France in their fighting, but they lost, and Vietnam was divided along the 17th parallel. North Vietnam was communist-controlled in 1965. The U.S. started to bomb Hanoi, and war was in full swing. Domino theory, the idea that if one country goes down, they all go down. An idea that countries on the brink of communism were like dominoes set up in a line. The U.S. strongly felt that the domino effect would happen if we didn't step into war, so the U.S. made the decision to go in fear of communist spreading. East Asia Treaty Organization. The purpose of the organization was to prevent communism from gaining ground in the region. Thailand and the Philippines are the only Southeast Asian countries that became members. Finally, U.S. officials believed Southeast Asia to be a crucial frontier in the fight against communism expansion, so it viewed SCATO as essential to its global Cold War policy of containment. In Bangkok, Thailand, CEATO did not maintain military forces on its own, but the organization hosted joint military exercises for members of each state. Gulf of Tonkin. Alleged attack of U.S. ships by North Vietnamese ships in the Gulf of Tonkin that prompts President Johnson to ask and get broad military power in Vietnam. Information later revealed that the U.S. had been conducting secret raids against North Vietnam, and Johnson had prepared his plan. Offensive. On January 31st, 1968, some 70,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched the Tet Offensive, a coordinated series of fierce attacks on more than 100 cities and towns in South Vietnam. General Yo Nong Giap, leader of the Communist People Army of Vietnam, planned the offense in an attempt both to foment rebellion among the South Vietnamese population, encouraged the United States to scale back its support of the Saigon regime. Vietnamization. Upon taking office in 1969, U.S. President Richard Nixon introduced a new strategy called Vietnamization that was aimed at ending American involvement in the Vietnam War by transferring all military responsibilities to South Vietnam. The increasingly unpopular war had created deep divisions in American society. Nixon believed his Vietnamization strategy, which involved building up South Vietnam's military strength in order to facilitate a gradual withdrawal of U.S. troops, would prepare the South Vietnamese to take responsibility for their own defense against a communist takeover and allow the U.S. to leave the conflict with its honor intact. Paris Peace Accords. The United States, South Vietnam, Viet Cong, and North Vietnam formally signed an agreement ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam. in Paris. Due to South Vietnam's unwillingness to recognize the Viet Cong's provisional revolutionary government, all references to it were confined to a two-party version of the document signed by North Vietnam and the United States. The South Vietnamese were presented with a separate document that did not make references to the Viet Cong government. This was part of Saigon's long-time refusal to recognize that Viet Cong was a legitimate participant in the discussion to end the war. Discontent at home during Vietnam, the war divided the country in two different sections. The sections were the people who wanted war and the ones who didn't. The ones who wanted war were known as the Hawks, and the ones who didn't want war were known as the Doves. The Hawks believed that due to aggression of North Vietnamese, it forced us into the war. They thought that the United States should do whatever is necessary to win. Doves think that the problem in Vietnam is a civil war. They thought that the United States had no right to be in their conflicts. They also believed that the money that was spent there would be much better invested in America for certain programs. Early morning of June 17th, several burglars were arrested inside the office of the Democratic National Committee located in the Watergate building in Washington, D.C. The burglars were connected to President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign, and they had been caught while attempting to wiretape phones and steal secret documents. Nixon took steps to cover it up with hush money. In July, the Supreme Court ordered Nixon to turn over the tapes while the president dragged his feet. The House of Representatives voted to impeach him for obstruction of justice, abuse of power, criminal cover-up, and several violations of the Constitution. Equal Rights Amendment. In the early 1940s, the Republican Party and then the Democratic Party added support in the Equal Rights Amendment to their platforms. Alice Paul rewrote the ERA in 1943 to what is now the Alice Paul Amendment, reflecting the denied or abridged by the United States or by any state accounted of sex. But the labor movement was still committed to protective workplace laws, and social conservatives considered equal rights for women a threat to the existing power structure. In the workforce, during World War II, about 8 million entered the workforce to substitute the lack of men due to the war. By 1960, 40% worked for wages, and most jobs that were available paid women poorly, like domestic work, retail sales, teaching, and nursing. Kennedy's Presidential Commission on the Status of Women brought many discriminatory practices to light with a report in 1963. The National Urban League, which has played so pivotal a role in the 20th century freedom movement, grew out of that spontaneous grassroots movement for freedom and opportunity that came to be called the Black Migrations. When the U.S. Supreme Court declared its approval of segregation in the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson decision, the brutal system of economic, social, and political oppression the white South quickly adopted rapidly transformed what had been a trickle of African Americans northward into a flood. Those newcomers to the North soon discovered they had not escaped racial discrimination, excluded from all but mental jobs in the larger society, victimized by poor housing and education, and inexperienced in the ways of urban living. Many lived in terrible social and economic conditions.